The palace laughed because nobody believed a quiet man could survive enough war to become frightening. Rain hammered against the towering glass walls of the imperial palace while lightning rolled across the night sky above the floating capital of the Solaran Empire. Thousands of transport ships drifted through the storm beyond the enormous crystal domes, like silver ghosts moving through clouds of electric blue light. Inside the Grand Hall of Crowns, however, warmth and music drowned the weather completely. Gold chandeliers floated high above polished black marble floors while nobles from dozens of worlds gathered beneath holographic constellations rotating slowly across the vaulted ceiling. The imperial celebration had already lasted nearly 5 hours. Expensive alien wine flowed endlessly across silver tables, while orchestral musicians played soft ceremonial music from elevated platforms near the center of the hall. Every camera drone in the Empire broadcast the event live across thousands of systems because tonight marked the 20th year of Empress Veilira Sol's reign. And Veilira enjoyed attention the way stars enjoyed burning. She stood near the center throne platform wrapped in elegant sapphire black ceremonial robes lined with silver light thread embroidery that shimmered softly whenever she moved. Her sapphire purple skin reflected the palace lights beautifully, while her golden eyes scanned the room with practiced authority. Powerful, untouchable. Entire planetary governments feared disappointing her. Behind the throne platform stood Nathan Graves, motionless. A white human male around 45 years old wearing a black Imperial Guard uniform with silver shoulder markings and dark gloves folded neatly behind his back. Short brown hair touched slightly with gray near the temples. Calm gray eyes. No visible emotion. He had remained standing in nearly the same position for hours without eating, drinking, or speaking unless directly ordered. Most nobles ignored him completely. Human guards were common inside the Empire. Disposable, quiet, useful. Veilira noticed the silence surrounding him long ago and decided it irritated her. "Tell me something," she said suddenly, loud enough for nearby nobles and camera drones to hear. "Do humans ever smile while working?" Several aristocrats laughed softly around the throne platform. Nathan did not react. His eyes remained calmly fixed toward the ballroom exits beyond the dancing nobles. Veilira smirked slightly after receiving no answer. Perhaps Terran military discipline finally removed personality entirely. More laughter spread through the surrounding crowd. One noble lifted a glass toward Nathan mockingly. Maybe he is secretly a machine. The orchestra continued playing softly beneath the crystal lights, while rain streaked endlessly across the palace windows high above them. Nathan remained perfectly still behind the throne. No anger, no embarrassment. The complete lack of reaction somehow made the laughter feel smaller after a few seconds. Veilira noticed that too. "Look at him," she continued playfully while turning slightly toward the gathered nobles. "He stands like someone expecting war inside a ballroom." That line earned louder laughter from the surrounding aristocrats. But not everyone joined them. Near the far wine table beside the western balcony stood an elderly alien admiral wearing old military medals beneath a dark ceremonial coat. Admiral Corvin Tal had survived 3 frontier conflicts and buried more soldiers than most nobles could imagine. And the moment Veilira described Nathan's posture, the old admiral slowly stopped smiling entirely. His eyes narrowed toward the human guard behind the throne. Nathan had not moved once during the entire banquet. But Corvin noticed things civilians never learned to see. The angle of the shoulders, the spacing between feet, the way Nathan tracked reflections in ballroom glass instead of staring directly at movement. Survival posture, not palace training. The admiral lowered his wine glass slowly. "Impossible," he whispered quietly to himself. Nearby nobles continued laughing while camera drones floated lazily above the throne platform, capturing every reaction for the Imperial broadcast. Veilira glanced back toward Nathan with amused curiosity. "Tell me, human," she said lightly, "what exactly are you guarding us from tonight?" Nathan finally spoke. Calm voice. Low. Controlled. "Exits matter more than threats, Your Majesty." The ballroom laughter weakened slightly after hearing the answer. Not because the words sounded aggressive, because they sounded experienced. Admiral Corvin stared harder toward Nathan now. Then his eyes drifted lower toward the faded scar barely visible beneath the edge of the human's glove near his wrist. The old admiral's face quietly lost color. His wine glass slipped from his hand and shattered across the marble floor loud enough to silence half the ballroom instantly. Hundreds of nobles turned toward the sound beneath the glowing chandeliers, while the orchestra faltered uncertainly. Corvin never looked away from Nathan. "Dear God," the admiral whispered softly beneath the sudden silence. "That mark belongs to Deathworld Black Command. Veterans do not fear famous soldiers. They fear the quiet ones nobody survived long enough to describe properly." Silence spread slowly through the Grand Hall of Crowns after Admiral Corvin Tal dropped his shattered wine glass across the marble floor. The orchestra faltered awkwardly beneath the floating chandeliers while hundreds of nobles turned toward the elderly war veteran standing near the western balcony. Rain continued streaking across the enormous crystal windows beyond the palace walls, turning the storm outside into rivers of blue lightning reflected across polished black stone. But inside the ballroom, nobody seemed interested in the weather anymore. Every eye had shifted toward the human guard standing motionless behind the imperial throne. Nathan Graves did not react to the admiral's words. Same calm posture, hands folded neatly behind his back, gray eyes quietly scanning exits and reflections through the ballroom glass, instead of focusing on conversations directly. That detail unsettled Corvin more than the scar itself. Only survivors watched reflections instead of faces. Empress Valyra Sol tilted her head slightly with amused confusion while nobles whispered nervously around the throne platform. "Deathworld Black Command?" she repeated lightly. "That sounds dramatically outdated." Several aristocrats laughed uncertainly, though the laughter carried less confidence now. Admiral Corvin did not smile. It was not outdated to the colonies that surrendered after hearing those units arrived in orbit. The room quieted again. Nathan finally looked toward the old admiral for the first time that evening. No anger crossed his face, only recognition. Corvin's expression darkened immediately after realizing the human remembered him too. "Impossible," the admiral whispered softly beneath his breath. Nearby camera drones floated closer toward the exchange, their silver lenses rotating silently beneath the glowing chandeliers, while the live Imperial broadcast continued streaming across thousands of systems. Valyra noticed the growing discomfort among the veterans scattered throughout the ballroom and found herself unexpectedly curious. "Human," she said calmly while turning slightly toward Nathan. "What exactly was Deathworld Black Command?" Nathan answered without hesitation. "An old military division, Your Majesty." "Doing what?" Long pause. Rain hammered softly against the palace glass high above them. "Ending wars." The simplicity of the answer unsettled the room more effectively than arrogance would have. One younger noble laughed nervously while adjusting his ceremonial collar. "You speak as though one soldier could frighten entire governments." Nathan looked toward the ballroom windows where distant lightning illuminated the floating capital outside. "No government fears one soldier," he said quietly. "They fear what survives after enough wars." Several military veterans near the wine tables visibly lowered their eyes after hearing that. Valyra noticed immediately. The emotional reaction confused her more than the words themselves. She had ruled empires long enough to recognize political fear when she saw it. And the old veterans surrounding her suddenly looked deeply uncomfortable standing near her own guard. One palace security officer quietly activated a standard background scan from his wrist console while pretending to monitor ballroom systems. Nathan noticed instantly. Tiny shift of the eyes. Nothing more. Seconds later, the officer's scanner emitted a sharp denial tone loud enough for nearby nobles to hear. "Access restricted. Imperial authority insufficient." Whispering spread quickly through the ballroom beneath the crystal lights. The officer frowned and attempted a deeper military archive scan. Same result. Classification sealed under Terran war protocol. Valyra's amusement faded slightly. Why would a palace guard possess sealed military authority beyond imperial access? Nobody answered immediately, because the veterans already understood something the politicians did not. Nathan's identity was not protected for prestige. It was buried intentionally. Admiral Corvin slowly approached the throne platform with visible hesitation beneath the golden ballroom lights. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, I strongly advise ending this broadcast. Veolyra narrowed her golden eyes. Because of a human guard? Corvin looked directly toward Nathan again. Because military archives do not hide heroes. Silence followed. Nathan remained perfectly still while camera drones continued floating around the throne platform, recording every second for the Empire, watching live across distant worlds. Then suddenly one of the palace security systems activated automatically above the ballroom. Holographic symbols flickered across the ceiling. Unauthorized archive recognition detected. Military identification request initiated. Several nobles looked upward nervously as ancient Terran military insignias slowly materialized above the ballroom in cold white light. Nathan finally closed his eyes briefly like a tired man recognizing an old nightmare returning. And somewhere deep beneath the palace floor, the Imperial Archive systems quietly began counting. The deadliest records in the galaxy were never hidden because they were false. They were hidden because they were true. The Grand Hall of Crowns fell into uneasy silence beneath the floating chandeliers, while ancient military symbols rotated slowly across the palace ceiling in cold white holographic light. Rain continued crashing against the massive crystal walls surrounding the Imperial Ballroom, turning the floating city outside into blurred rivers of silver and electric blue beneath the midnight storm. Hundreds of nobles stood frozen beside long banquet tables covered in untouched wine glasses and glowing ceremonial dishes. Nobody cared about the celebration anymore. Every eye in the hall remained fixed on the human guard standing quietly behind the imperial throne while the palace archive systems awakened around him like something old and buried had just remembered his name. Nathan Graves remained motionless beneath the shifting military projections. Calm gray eyes. Hands folded behind his back. No visible fear. Yet Empress Veolyra's soul noticed one detail that unsettled her deeply for reasons she could not explain. Nathan looked tired. Not nervous. Not angry. Exhausted. As though the palace systems reopening his history felt less dangerous than disappointing. Above the ballroom floor, holographic text slowly spread across the ceiling in harsh Terran military formatting completely different from the elegant imperial architecture surrounding it. Accessing sealed Deathworld records. Authorization override accepted. Several older military officials visibly stepped backward after reading the words. One noble near the orchestra platform whispered nervously, "Why would an imperial archive connect to Terran war systems automatically?" Admiral Corvin answered quietly without looking away from Nathan. Because Deathworld protocols outrank politics. The orchestra had stopped playing entirely now. Even the camera drones floating above the ballroom seemed quieter as their silver lenses focused tightly toward the throne platform. Across thousands of worlds, entire systems watched the Imperial broadcast in growing confusion while military analysts and veterans slowly recognized the ancient Terran insignias appearing above the palace ceiling. Veolyra studied Nathan carefully beneath the rotating white projections. "You knew this would happen," she said softly. Nathan's eyes remained on the ballroom exits. "Eventually. Then why stay?" Long silence. Rain rolled endlessly across the crystal dome overhead. Running would have frightened people more. The answer lingered heavily through the hall. Before Veolyra could respond, the holographic archive suddenly changed. New text appeared above the ballroom in enormous white numbers. Deathworld Black Command Operative confirmed. Casualty record synchronization initiated. Then the counting began. A single number appeared first, then another, then dozens more. The total increased rapidly across the palace ceiling while soft mechanical tones echoed through the ballroom every few seconds. Hundreds. Thousands. Tens of thousands. Nobles stared upward in disbelief as the number continued climbing without stopping. Some guests laughed nervously at first, assuming the system malfunctioned. The laughter died quickly once military veterans stopped smiling entirely. Admiral Corvin looked physically ill beneath the ballroom lights. One older fleet commander slowly removed his ceremonial medals as though suddenly ashamed to wear them. Veolyra felt cold discomfort tighten inside her chest while the numbers continued rising overhead. "No human survives that many campaigns," one noble whispered shakily. Nathan finally looked upward briefly toward the glowing count projected across the ceiling. His expression did not change. that frightened the room more than the number itself. Because nobody watching the count climb above impossible military statistics could understand how the quiet guard beneath the throne still looked so calm. A palace officer approached Veolara, nervously carrying a tactical data screen. "Your Majesty," he whispered urgently. "The archive identifies most of these casualty events as warzone eliminations during civilian evacuation operations." Veolara frowned. "Evacuations?" The officer swallowed hard. "The records show he repeatedly entered active collapse zones after military retreat orders." Silence spread again. Different silence this time. Confused silence. The ballroom had expected a monster hidden behind a uniform. But the military archive kept attaching the same phrase repeatedly beside Nathan's impossible kill count. Civilian extraction prioritized. One elderly noble looked toward Nathan in disbelief. Why would anyone survive that many wars just to become a palace guard afterward? Nathan lowered his eyes from the glowing numbers above the hall. "Because eventually," he answered quietly, "the dead stop feeling like victories." The sentence landed across the ballroom heavier than the military archive itself. No one spoke afterward. Not the nobles. Not the veterans. Not even the Empress standing beneath the throne lights beside the human she mocked less than an hour earlier. Because while the archive continued counting the dead above the palace ceiling, the exhausted man beneath it looked less like a conqueror and more like someone who remembered every single number personally. The moment a crowd stops celebrating death, they finally begin understanding the cost of survival. The Grand Hall of Crowns remained frozen beneath the glowing military projections, while ancient Terran archive systems continued illuminating the palace ceiling in cold white light. Rain rolled endlessly across the crystal dome high above the ballroom, turning the storm outside into rivers of silver and electric blue reflected through polished marble floors. The imperial celebration no longer resembled a banquet. Music had stopped entirely. Wine glasses sat untouched across endless silver tables while nobles and diplomats stood motionless beneath the chandeliers, staring upward at the impossible casualty total still suspended over the hall. The number had finally stopped climbing minutes earlier. Yet nobody looked relieved, because the final count remained hanging above them like a grave marker too enormous to understand emotionally. Nathan Graves stood exactly where he had all evening behind the imperial throne platform. Calm posture, hands folded behind his back, gray eyes quietly scanning the ballroom exits while camera drones floated around him in nervous silence. The palace broadcast still streamed live across the empire, though nobody seemed interested in political speeches anymore. Entire worlds now watched a quiet human guard standing beneath one of the most terrifying military records ever uncovered publicly. Empress Veolara Sol studied Nathan carefully beneath the holographic projections. Earlier that evening she laughed at him because silence looked primitive beside imperial elegance. Now the same silence felt heavy enough to suffocate the room. "How many wars?" she asked quietly. Nathan answered without hesitation. "Too many." The simplicity of the response unsettled her again. One younger noble near the orchestra platform finally found the courage to speak. "The archive must be exaggerating." Admiral Corvin turned toward him sharply. "Terran military systems do not exaggerate casualty reports." The noble swallowed nervously. Then no human mind should survive those numbers. Nathan finally looked toward the young aristocrat. No anger, no pride, just tired honesty. Most do not. Silence followed immediately afterward. Several veterans lowered their eyes again beneath the ballroom lights, while rain hammered softly across the palace glass above them. Veolara noticed something strange spreading through the room now. Not fear exactly. Guilt. The Empire spent years romanticizing war from safe palace balconies, while the humans standing behind her throne looked like someone still carrying every battlefield home internally. One palace archivist hurried nervously through the ballroom, carrying a glowing data tablet toward the throne platform. "Your Majesty," she whispered shakily. Additional archive material unlocked after casualty synchronization completed. Veolara accepted the tablet carefully beneath the hovering projections. The recovered records displayed battlefield summaries, extraction logs, and psychological evaluations connected to Nathan's service history. But one phrase repeated itself over and over again across nearly every classified mission file. Civilian priority maintained despite operational losses. Veolyra frowned slightly. You repeatedly abandoned tactical advantages to evacuate civilians? Nathan remained motionless. Children panic slower if someone stays calm near them. The ballroom fell silent again. Not because the answer sounded heroic. Because it sounded practiced. Natural. Like something he learned through painful repetition. Admiral Corvin quietly stepped closer beneath the chandelier lights. The frontier collapses, he said softly. You were there during the Veyron evacuations. Nathan's expression changed slightly for the first time all evening. Very small. Barely visible. Sadness. Yes. Corvin lowered his eyes. My fleet arrived after the cities burned. Nathan looked toward the rain-covered windows surrounding the palace. Most fleets arrived afterward. The old admiral visibly struggled to answer. Finally, he asked the question everyone in the ballroom secretly feared. How did you survive that many campaigns? Nathan remained quiet for several seconds while thunder rolled softly beyond the crystal dome overhead. Then he answered in the calmest voice imaginable. I stopped thinking survival meant winning. The sentence spread through the hall heavier than the casualty count itself. Even the camera drones seemed to hover more quietly afterward. Veolyra stared toward Nathan beneath the glowing military archive, and suddenly realized the Empire misunderstood him completely. The terrifying part was never the number above the ballroom ceiling. It was the exhausted humanity still standing beneath it. One noble whispered shakily toward another nearby. Why would someone like him become a palace guard? Before anyone else could answer, Nathan adjusted the cuff of his black uniform calmly and looked toward the massive ballroom entrance where servants quietly escorted frightened junior staff away from the overwhelming atmosphere. Because, he said softly, protecting living people feels better than counting dead ones. And for the first time that night, nobody inside the Imperial Palace laughed at the human guard anymore. The galaxy expected warriors to enjoy killing. Nobody knew what to do with the ones who regretted surviving it. The Grand Hall of Crowns felt colder, now despite the golden chandeliers still glowing above the ballroom. Rain continued crashing softly against the crystal walls surrounding the Imperial Palace, while distant lightning illuminated the floating capital beyond the glass domes in waves of silver and blue. The Imperial celebration had transformed completely. Nobles no longer laughed beside the wine tables. Musicians sat quietly near their instruments without permission to resume playing. Even the camera drones broadcasting across the Empire drifted through the ballroom more cautiously now, their silver lenses fixed toward the human guards standing behind the throne platform beneath the hovering military archive projections. Nathan Graves remained perfectly still while the impossible casualty count continued glowing across the ceiling overhead. Calm posture, tired gray eyes, hands folded neatly behind his back. No pride existed anywhere in his expression. That detail unsettled the room more than the numbers themselves. Because the Empire understood conquest. It understood ambition. But it did not understand someone carrying that much death while looking ashamed of it. Empress Veolyra's soul slowly descended from the throne platform beneath the watching eyes of hundreds of nobles. Her sapphire-black ceremonial robes flowed softly across the polished marble floor, while the holographic military symbols reflected faintly across her purple skin. For the first time in years, the most powerful woman in the Empire looked uncertain inside her own palace. She stopped directly in front of Nathan. "Walk with me," she said quietly. Nathan nodded once. No hesitation. No surprise. Together, they moved away from the ballroom through a long corridor lined with towering crystal windows overlooking the storm-covered capital below. Palace guards remained behind at a respectful distance, while rain rolled endlessly across the glass beside them. The hallway felt strangely quiet after the overwhelming atmosphere of the ballroom. Only distant thunder and soft footsteps echoed through the enormous palace corridors. Veolyra finally spoke once they reached the eastern balcony overlooking the lower city sectors far beneath the floating palace. "Why did you never tell anyone?" Nathan rested one gloved hand lightly against the cold crystal railing while transport lights drifted through the storm below, like tiny stars moving through darkness. Nobody asked the right questions. Veolyra folded her arms tightly against the cool night air. "You allowed the court to mock you." Nathan looked toward the rain-covered skyline. It kept them comfortable. The answer unsettled her again. Comfortable. Nathan nodded slightly. People become nervous around veterans once they realize how many funerals built their peace. Silence settled between them while thunder rolled softly across the distant clouds. Veilira studied his face carefully beneath the pale balcony lights. Earlier that evening she saw a silent human guard standing behind her throne. Now she saw exhaustion so deep it felt ancient. The archive records called you one of the most successful Deathworld operatives in Terran history, she said quietly. Nathan gave a faint, tired smile that vanished almost immediately. Successful is a generous word for surviving. Veilira looked down toward the glowing city beneath the palace. Millions of civilians slept peacefully below them without understanding how fragile peace truly was. Did the killing ever become easier? She asked softly. Nathan remained silent for several long seconds while rainwater streaked endlessly across the crystal balcony walls. Finally, he answered in the calmest voice imaginable. No, the honesty in the single word hit harder than the military archive ever could. Veilira slowly turned toward him. Then how did you continue? Nathan's eyes drifted downward toward the lower transport sectors, where workers still moved through the storm despite the late hour. Because somebody needed to stand between frightened people and worse things. The sentence lingered quietly in the cold air. Veilira noticed his eyes never lingered on the Imperial towers or upper districts. He watched the workers, the maintenance crews, the civilians walking home through rain far below the palace lights. You do not hate them, she realized softly. Nathan looked mildly confused. Who? The people who laughed at you tonight. Long silence. Then Nathan shook his head once. Most civilians only understand war through stories. His gray eyes drifted back toward the storm outside. That is probably a good thing. Veilira stared at him beneath the rain-streaked balcony lights and finally understood why the old veterans inside the ballroom looked so shaken earlier. The terrifying part was never the number of deaths attached to Nathan Graves. It was the impossible humanity still alive inside him afterward. Somewhere behind them inside the palace, the Imperial Archive still displayed the casualty count across the ballroom ceiling. But out on the balcony above the sleeping city, the exhausted human guard looked less like a legend and more like someone quietly carrying ghosts nobody else could see. The people most damaged by war are usually the ones trying hardest to prevent it from happening again. Rain continued sweeping across the crystal walls of the Imperial Palace, while thunder rolled softly above the floating capital beyond the balcony. Far below the towering Imperial districts, millions of transport lights drifted through the storm like glowing rivers moving between layers of steel and glass suspended above the clouds. Nathan Graves stood beside the eastern balcony railing in complete silence, one gloved hand resting lightly against the cold crystal surface while his gray eyes followed the movement of civilian traffic far beneath the palace. Calm posture, controlled breathing. Yet now that Empress Veilira's soul stood close enough to observe him carefully, she noticed the exhaustion hidden inside every small movement he made. Not physical exhaustion, something older. He carried stillness the way wounded people carried old scars beneath clothing. Behind them, the Grand Hall of Crowns remained unnaturally quiet. The Imperial Archive continued displaying Nathan's military casualty count above the ballroom ceiling, while frightened nobles whispered nervously around untouched banquet tables. Across the Empire, billions of viewers watched the palace broadcast replay fragments of the sealed Deathworld records that should never have surfaced publicly. Yet none of that seemed important to Nathan anymore. He kept watching the city below instead. Veilira studied him beneath the soft balcony lights, while rainwater streaked endlessly across the crystal walls around them. The archives called your unit psychologically unstable, she said quietly. Nathan nodded once. That was accurate. Because of the killing? Long silence. Thunder vibrated softly through the palace structure overhead. Because empathy survived longer than expected. The answer confused her immediately. Empathy. Nathan looked toward the lower city sectors where maintenance crews still worked through the storm beneath glowing transport rails. Most militaries train soldiers to detach emotionally, he explained calmly. It improves battlefield efficiency. Veilira folded her arms against the cool night air. But your unit did not. Nathan's expression darkened slightly beneath the balcony lights. We stayed attached. The words lingered heavily between them. Somewhere inside the palace behind them, Nobles still whispered fearfully about casualty numbers and military legends. But out on the balcony, Nathan sounded less like a terrifying operative and more like someone describing a permanent injury. Veolyra leaned lightly against the crystal railing beside him. Why would empathy make soldiers unstable? Nathan finally looked toward her directly. For the first time all night, she noticed how tired his eyes truly were. Because eventually you remember every face. Silence followed. Rain hammered softly against the balcony glass, while distant lightning illuminated the floating skyline beyond them in pale blue flashes. Veolyra felt cold discomfort tighten inside her chest, hearing the honesty hidden beneath his calm voice. The Empire teaches that emotional detachment creates stronger warriors, she said softly. Nathan gave a faint, humorless smile. Detached warriors are easier to command. The sentence landed harder than she expected. One palace servant quietly entered the balcony corridor carrying fresh tea before freezing nervously after recognizing the tension between the Empress and the human guard. Nathan noticed immediately. "You can leave it there," he said gently toward the servant. The young worker visibly relaxed after hearing his calm tone and quickly placed the tray beside the balcony entrance before hurrying away. Veolyra watched the exchange carefully. The servant feared imperial nobles more than the human whose military record terrified entire governments. That realization unsettled her deeply. "You always notice civilians first," she observed quietly. Nathan picked up one of the untouched teacups from the tray and held it carefully between both hands beneath the cold balcony lights. Steam drifted upward into the storm air around them. Soldiers usually remember civilians longer than enemies. Veolyra stared toward the glowing city below, while trying to imagine surviving enough war for that sentence to feel natural. She could not. No imperial education prepared rulers for the emotional weight hidden inside men like Nathan Graves. "And now," she asked softly, "after all those campaigns?" Nathan looked down toward the tea, warming his hands. "Now I prefer standing near peaceful places." The answer carried no dramatic weight. No self-pity, just quiet honesty. Behind them, the Imperial Archive still counted the dead across palace ceilings and broadcast systems. Yet the exhausted humans standing beside the balcony looked far more interested in whether frightened servants reached home safely through the storm. Veolyra slowly realized something the Empire never understood about Deathworld survivors. Their terrifying reputation did not come from how effectively they killed during war. It came from the impossible fact that after witnessing enough death to break ordinary minds completely, some of them still cared whether strangers stayed warm in the rain. The people who survive the most war usually become the fastest to recognize fear in others. The storm above the floating capital intensified again shortly after midnight. Rain hammered across the crystal domes of the Imperial Palace, while lightning rolled through dark clouds surrounding the upper transport lanes beyond the skyline. Inside the eastern palace balconies, however, the atmosphere remained strangely quiet. Empress Veolyra Sol stood beside Nathan Graves beneath soft silver lighting while steam drifted upward from untouched teacups resting near the crystal railing. Far below them, millions of civilians continued moving through the rain-covered city without understanding that the Imperial broadcast still displayed one of the most terrifying military records in galactic history above the ballroom ceiling behind them. Yet Nathan no longer seemed interested in the archive. His gray eyes remained focused toward the lower transport sectors and maintenance districts beneath the Imperial towers instead. Veolyra followed his gaze curiously. "You keep watching the service districts," she observed quietly. Nathan nodded once. "Night crews finish shifts around this time. You know their schedules?" "Most guards should." The answer sounded simple. Ordinary. Yet nothing about Nathan felt ordinary anymore. Before Veolyra could continue speaking, the palace lights flickered once across the balcony corridor behind them. Tiny interruption. Barely noticeable. Nathan reacted immediately. Not dramatic. Just instant awareness. His posture shifted slightly while his eyes tracked toward the far western wing of the palace beyond the ballroom sectors. Veolyra noticed at once. "What is wrong?" Nathan listened quietly for several seconds while rain struck the crystal walls around them. "Power fluctuation," he answered softly. "Localized." One palace officer rushed into the balcony corridor moments later carrying an illuminated tactical display. The young guard looked pale beneath the emergency lighting. Your Majesty, he said breathlessly, multiple security systems inside the lower servant corridors just failed simultaneously. Nathan closed his eyes briefly. Tired recognition crossed his face like someone hearing an old song he hated. Evacuation routes, he asked immediately. Offline in sectors 4 through 7. Nathan handed his untouched teacup back toward the tray without another word and began walking toward the corridor. Veolyra followed instantly despite the officer's visible discomfort. The lower palace sectors looked completely different from the luxurious imperial ballroom above them. Narrow metallic hallways, cargo elevators, service corridors lined with supply containers and maintenance terminals. The elegant image of Empire disappeared quickly beneath the throne levels. Emergency lights pulsed softly red across steel walls while frightened servants and musicians gathered uncertainly near locked security doors. Palace workers whispered nervously while trying to contact missing co-workers through failing communication systems. Nathan moved through the corridor calmly while scanning exits, ventilation shafts, and civilian density with one slow glance. Same quiet posture, same controlled breathing. But now every palace guard unconsciously waited for his reactions before moving themselves. One terrified servant rushed toward him. The lower kitchens lost power completely, she said shakily. Some of the younger workers are trapped near the freight elevators. Nathan nodded once. Move everyone away from maintenance corridors and keep the civilians together. The woman obeyed instantly. Veolyra noticed again how naturally frightened people trusted him. Not because of rank, because his calm made panic feel temporary. A loud metallic sound echoed somewhere deeper inside the lower palace levels. Several servants gasped. Palace guards immediately reached for weapons. Nathan stepped forward before anyone else moved, placing himself automatically between the sound and the civilians gathered behind him. Relaxed shoulders, steady breathing, protective positioning so instinctive it looked permanent. Veolyra stared at him beneath the red emergency lights. You already know what this is, she whispered quietly. Nathan's eyes remained fixed toward the dark maintenance corridor ahead. Desperate people. The answer unsettled her more than fear would have. One frightened kitchen worker nearby whispered shakily toward Nathan. Are we in danger? Nathan finally looked toward the civilians gathered behind him. Servants, musicians, young workers still wearing formal banquet uniforms from the imperial celebration upstairs. Ordinary people trapped beneath the palace while systems failed around them. His exhausted gray eyes softened slightly. Not while everyone stays calm. The simplicity of the response steadied the corridor immediately. Even the frightened workers breathed easier after hearing it. Somewhere deeper inside the palace, alarms finally began echoing through the lower sectors while emergency doors sealed automatically across several service wings. But Nathan did not look afraid. He looked familiar with fear itself. Veolyra suddenly understood something the Empire never taught its rulers. The most dangerous part of surviving impossible wars was not learning how to fight. It was learning how to recognize panic before anyone else noticed it beginning. Empires fear rebellion because rebellion reminds them how many ordinary people were ignored long before anyone picked up weapons. The lower palace service sectors descended into controlled chaos beneath pulsing emergency lights, while rain thundered across the crystal domes far above the imperial towers. Metallic corridors glowed deep red beneath lockdown systems as frightened servants, musicians, and maintenance workers crowded together near sealed security doors clutching supply cases and communication tablets with trembling hands. Somewhere deeper beneath the palace structure, power failures continued spreading through cargo elevators and lower transit corridors, while alarms echoed through the steel hallways like distant mechanical sirens. Yet despite the growing panic, Nathan Graves remained perfectly calm at the center of the corridor. Same quiet posture, same controlled breathing, gray eyes tracking movement, sound, and civilian positioning simultaneously with the effortless awareness of someone who survived too many collapsing places before this one. Empress Veolyra Sol stood slightly behind him, now beside a group of frightened palace workers wrapped in emergency thermal blankets. Earlier that evening, those same workers would never have dared stand close to the imperial throne. But fear erased social hierarchy quickly. Nathan understood that instinctively. One palace security officer hurried toward them carrying a tactical scanner. Your Majesty, he said nervously, multiple unauthorized individuals breached the western maintenance sectors. Nathan immediately looked toward the ventilation corridors overhead. How many? At least 6 confirmed. Nathan listened quietly to the corridor sounds around them before speaking again. No military formation. The officer frowned. What? Their movement patterns are uneven. Nathan's eyes narrowed slightly toward the dark service tunnel ahead. Not trained soldiers. Veilira stared toward him beneath the emergency lights. Then who are they? Nathan remained silent for several seconds while frightened civilians huddled quietly behind the security barricades. Finally, he answered softly. Hungry people. The sentence unsettled the corridor more than the alarms themselves. Moments later, distant footsteps echoed through the maintenance sectors ahead. Fast. Nervous. Several palace guards raised defensive weapons immediately while servants gasped softly behind them. Nathan stepped forward alone before anyone else moved. Calm posture. Empty hands visible. Protective positioning between the approaching corridor and the civilians gathered behind him. The footsteps stopped abruptly near the shadowed maintenance entrance. Then several figures slowly emerged beneath the flickering red lights. Young, thin, wearing stolen utility uniforms and improvised breathing masks. Not professional assassins. Not elite rebels. Frightened civilians carrying desperation like armor. One young intruder raised a shaking pulse tool toward the corridor. Stay back, he warned unsteadily. Nathan's gray eyes studied the trembling hands carefully. You are not here to kill anyone. The young man looked startled by the statement. You do not know why we came. Nathan glanced briefly toward the worn worker patches hidden beneath the stolen utility jacket. Yes, he answered quietly. I do. Silence spread through the corridor. Even the palace guards hesitated now. Veilira watched Nathan carefully beneath the emergency lights, while rain echoed faintly through the palace structure above them. The lower city ration sectors failed again this month. Nathan continued calmly. You lost supply access 3 weeks ago. The young intruders stared at him in disbelief. One finally lowered his weapon slightly. How would an Imperial Guard know that? Nathan looked toward the frightened workers behind him. Because civilians panic differently when they are starving instead of angry. The answer settled heavily through the corridor. Veilira suddenly realized Nathan had probably identified the situation long before the palace systems recognized a threat at all. Not because he was trained for violence. Because he recognized fear itself too easily. One of the younger intruders looked toward the servants hiding behind the barricades and slowly lowered his improvised weapon completely. We only wanted access to emergency food storage, he admitted quietly. Several palace guards exchanged stunned looks. Nathan nodded once. I know. The calm certainty in his voice dissolved most of the remaining tension instantly. No threats. No dramatic confrontation. Just exhausted people on both sides of the corridor finally recognizing each other. Veilira stepped slowly beside Nathan while studying the frightened intruders beneath the emergency lights. Young workers from neglected lower districts. Desperate enough to infiltrate the Imperial Palace for food supplies during a storm. The Empire would normally classify them as criminals before sunrise. Nathan looked toward the nearest security officer calmly. Open storage sector 4. The officer blinked in disbelief. Sir. Nathan's tired gray eyes remained fixed on the frightened civilians ahead. Hungry people make worse decisions when cornered. Long silence followed. Then something extraordinary happened inside the lower palace corridor. The palace guards obeyed him. Not because of rank. Not because of fear. Because the exhausted humans standing beneath the red emergency lights somehow understood suffering more clearly than the empire ruling above it. A civilization does not reveal its true character during victory. It reveals it in how it treats frightened people after the alarms stop. Dawn arrived slowly above the floating capital of the Solaran Empire. The storm clouds that swallowed the city through the night finally began breaking apart beyond the Imperial Towers, while pale golden sunlight spread carefully across endless layers of silver skyscrapers and glowing transport lanes drifting high above the clouds. Rainwater still rolled down the crystal domes of the Imperial Palace in soft rivers of light, turning the first sunrise reflections into streams of gold across the glass walls overlooking the waking city below. Inside the lower palace sectors, the emergency alarms had finally gone silent. Frightened servants rested beneath thermal blankets along the service corridors while exhausted workers distributed emergency food packs from reopened storage sectors under dim morning lights. The young intruders from the lower districts sat quietly near the maintenance hall in trances surrounded not by armed soldiers, but by medics and palace staff carrying warm meals and clean clothing. No one screamed anymore. No one ran. The fear had passed. Nathan Graves stood alone near the eastern balcony overlooking the lower city sectors far beneath the palace. Same black Imperial Guard uniform. Same calm posture. One gloved hand rested lightly against the crystal railing while soft morning light reflected across his tired gray eyes. He looked exactly the same as he had during the Imperial banquet hours earlier. Yet the palace around him no longer saw him the same way. Behind him, footsteps approached quietly across the marble balcony floor. Empress Valara Sol stepped beside him beneath the pale sunrise, carrying 2 steaming metal cups between her hands. No royal attendants followed her now. No camera drones floated nearby. Just soft golden light and the distant sound of rain fading over the city below. Nathan glanced toward the cups briefly. Tea. Valara nodded once. Human style. Nathan accepted one carefully. Steam drifted upward into the cool morning air between them. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. The empire below slowly awakened beneath the breaking storm, while transport lights moved like glowing rivers through the clouds. Finally, Valara looked toward him quietly. The lower district workers will receive permanent food access after today. Nathan took a slow sip of tea. Good. The Senate will resist the decision. Probably. Valara studied his face beneath the morning light. You still speak as though people can improve. Nathan looked toward the city below, where maintenance crews already returned to repairing storm damage across the lower transport rails. Most people can, he answered softly, if someone gives them enough time. Silence returned gently after that. Warm silence this time. Human silence. Valara lowered her eyes briefly toward the tea, warming her hands. I laughed at you tonight. Nathan stared calmly toward the sunrise. Yes. And you still protected my palace afterward. Long pause. Rainwater continued sliding down the crystal walls beside them. Protecting people is easier than hating them, Nathan said quietly. The sentence settled softly into the cold morning air. Valara felt something inside her shift hearing it. Not political admiration. Something smaller. More honest. Respect. Real respect. She looked again toward the exhausted humans standing beside the balcony and finally understood why old veterans feared men like Nathan Graves so deeply. Not because they survived war. Because after surviving enough death to destroy ordinary souls completely, they still chose kindness anyway. Somewhere behind them inside the palace, the military archive still displayed Nathan's impossible casualty count across secured Imperial systems. But out on the balcony above the waking city, the number no longer felt important. The tired human holding warm tea beneath the sunrise looked less like a weapon and more like the final survivor of a world that taught compassion the hardest possible way. Below them, civilians crossed bridges and transit lanes while morning light slowly erased the storm from the city skyline. Nathan watched the workers moving through the dawn with quiet attention, while Valara stood beside him in silence. No throne between them. No audience. No laughter left. Only 2 exhausted people watching a frightened empire wake up a little more human than it had been the night before.